My mom forced me to wear a catering uniform to my brother's engagement gala. "Serve the caviar and don't make eye contact with the rich guests," she commanded. I served 50 VIPs in dead silence. When the bride's father saw me, he dropped his glass. "Sir, why are you wearing that?" he stammered. "Tell me this is some silly joke and that you aren't pulling your $3 billion funding on Monday." Before I tell you about the exact moment my family's entire fake reality collapsed into dust, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. The sound of that crystal champagne flute shattering against the imported Italian marble floor sounded exactly like a gunshot echoing through the massive ballroom. It was a loud, sharp, violent noise that instantly sliced through the low hum of wealthy chatter and stopped the classical string quartet dead in their tracks. 50 of the most powerful politicians, tech executives, and old money socialites on the eastern seaboard turned their heads in absolute, unbroken unison. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. It felt exactly like the chilling silence at a funeral right before the casket is lowered into the ground. I stood there, perfectly still, anchoring my feet to the floor. I could feel the scratchy, incredibly cheap polyester of the black catering vest itching terribly against the collar of my neck. In my hands, I held a heavy, ornate silver tray loaded with imported beluga caviar resting on tiny, crisp toast points. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I just stared straight into the terrified, pale, completely bloodless face of Desmond Gallagher. Desmond was a titan of the American tech industry. He was a billionaire. He was a man who routinely fired senior executives before he even finished his morning coffee. And right now, in the middle of his own daughter's engagement gala, he was shaking. His hands trembled so violently that he had to reach out and grip the edge of a high-top cocktail table just to keep his knees from buckling beneath him. Out of the corner of my right eye, I saw my mother, Margaret. Her face, usually so carefully pulled and powdered to project an image of effortless wealth, twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. She took a hesitant step forward, her expensive designer high heels clicking sharply on the stone floor. She opened her mouth to speak, probably to scold me for dropping something or for bothering the single most important guest in the room. But the words completely died in her throat. She looked like a fish gasping for air. My younger brother, Carter, the supposed guest of honor, the golden child of our family, stood a few feet away. He was holding a glass of terribly expensive bourbon, and his signature arrogant smirk was entirely melting away into a puddle of pathetic, wide-eyed confusion. He looked frantically at Desmond, his future father-in-law, and then he looked directly at me, the older brother he had just ordered to fetch him a fresh drink like I was a piece of disposable garbage. "Desmond, is everything all right?" My mother finally managed to choke out. Her voice pitched up awkwardly, desperately trying to maintain the flawless, high-society facade she had spent decades meticulously building. "Is this server bothering you? I can have him removed by security immediately." Desmond didn't even look at her. He didn't acknowledge her existence. His eyes were completely glued to my face, panic radiating in waves from every pore of his body. He took a staggering step past his massive private security detail, completely ignoring the shards of broken glass crunching loudly under his leather shoes, and stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. He bowed his head, a full, undeniable bow of total submission in front of 50 of his elite peers. "Sir," Desmond whispered, his voice cracking loudly in the silent, echoing room, "I am profoundly horrified. Why is the sole founder of Apex Vanguard, the man who personally holds the patents to my entire global network, serving fish eggs to my junior staff?" The collective gasp that rippled through the room was intoxicating. I watched my mother physically stumble backward into a towering floral arrangement. How did we get here? To understand the absolute absurdity of this moment, we have to rewind the clock. You know how some families have a golden child? The one who can do absolutely no wrong, the one who gets the best cuts of meat at dinner, the one who gets celebrated just for waking up in the morning? In my family, that was Carter. My mother, Margaret, practically worshipped the ground his designer sneakers walked on. She spent her entire adult life meticulously crafting a heavy, completely manufactured family narrative. In her twisted story, Carter was the flawless, handsome prince destined for greatness. I, on the other hand, was the stubborn, unmanageable disappointment who wasted his potential and embarrassed the family name. While Carter was busy taking private tennis lessons at the country club and getting fitted for tailored suits my parents could barely afford, I spent my childhood isolated in our detached, unheated garage. It was freezing in the winter and sweltering in the summer, but it was my sanctuary. I dismantled old, broken computers I found sitting on the curb on trash day. I taught myself how to code by reading dog-eared library books. I built functional servers out of scrap parts and tangled wires. My mother hated it with a burning passion. She constantly complained that it made the house look like a junkyard. She said my hands were always dirty, and my clothes always smelled like soldering iron smoke and cheap metal. My father, Richard, was essentially a ghost in his own house. He worked long, grueling hours at a mid-level insurance firm and avoided household conflict at all costs. Whenever my mother berated me, whenever she changed the lock on the garage door so I couldn't get to my equipment, he just sat in his recliner and stared blankly at his newspaper. His deafening silence was his ultimate endorsement of her cruelty. The real breaking point, the moment that fractured my relationship with my family beyond any hope of repair, happened when I was 18 years old. I had just won a prestigious regional science fair with a prototype for a highly advanced data compression algorithm. It wasn't just a ribbon. I was formally invited to an exclusive awards banquet where several prominent local tech companies were offering lucrative, entry-level internships to the winners. It was my golden ticket out of that house. I ran into the kitchen, clutching the invitation in my hands, feeling a rare, overwhelming surge of genuine pride. Margaret took one look at the piece of paper, snatched it out of my hand, and tossed it carelessly onto the kitchen counter like it was a piece of junk mail. "You can't go to that on Saturday," she said flatly, not even making eye contact with me as she wiped down the sink. "It's Carter's 16th birthday. We are hosting a massive dinner party for his friends and their parents. I need you to wash the cars in the driveway and help the caterers set up the folding chairs on the patio." "Mom, this is my future," I pleaded, my voice cracking with desperation. "This is an actual career opportunity. Carter is having a pool party. He doesn't need me there. Half of his friends don't even talk to me." She slammed the wet dish towel onto the marble counter. Her eyes narrowed into angry slits. "Your future? Playing with wires in the dark. Please, Elijah, stop being selfish for once in your miserable life. Carter needs this. His friends' parents are very important people in this community. You are going to stay right here and be useful." I didn't argue further. I knew it was useless. But later that night, as I sat on the stairs in the dark, I overheard them talking in the living room. I heard my mother explicitly, casually state that she had completely drained the college fund they had supposedly been setting up for both of us for over a decade. She drained every single penny of my money to buy Carter a brand new, fully loaded BMW for his 16th birthday. The money my late grandparents had left specifically for my education was gone, completely vanished, spent on a luxury vehicle for a spoiled teenager who didn't even have a driver's license yet. I felt a cold, hard knot form in the pit of my stomach. I walked into my bedroom and packed a single duffel bag. I threw in a few changes of clothes, my laptop, and a notebook filled with my coding algorithms. I walked down the stairs and into the living room. Margaret looked up from her glossy magazine, clearly annoyed by my presence disrupting her evening. "I'm leaving," I said. My voice was surprisingly steady. I didn't feel sad. I just felt empty. She let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed in the quiet room. "And go where? To do what? You have no money. You have no degree. You think you're going to survive out there in the real world fixing broken keyboards? You will never earn a real salary, Elijah. You will always be a nobody. If you walk out that door tonight, do not expect a single dime from us ever again." I didn't yell. I didn't curse at her. I just turned around, walked out the front door into the freezing, pouring rain, and never looked back. The next 10 years of my life were a brutal, relentless, bone-crushing grind. I slept on the hard floors of tiny, cramped apartments that smelled like mildew. I worked 3 awful minimum-wage jobs just to pay for server space and electricity. I ate cheap ramen noodles until the mere smell of the seasoning packets made my stomach violently turn. But I kept building. I took that raw data compression algorithm I had designed in that freezing garage and I kept refining it, day after day, night after night. I met my business partner, Marcus, in a dingy, fluorescent-lit diner at 2 o'clock in the morning. He was a brilliant, exhausted network engineer who saw the vision immediately. He understood the architecture I was trying to build. Together, we founded Apex Vanguard. We started small, leasing our highly secure, incredibly fast proprietary architecture to mid-level financial firms who desperately needed better data protection. Then, after 3 years of knocking on doors and facing endless rejections, we landed our first major government contract. The floodgates completely opened. We didn't just build a successful tech company. We built the underlying physical infrastructure that a massive chunk of the modern internet relies on to function. We owned the massive, sprawling data centers. We owned the complex patents. We essentially became the invisible landlords of the digital age. I went from sleeping on a floor to managing a multi-billion-dollar empire. Through it all, my mother assumed I was still living in a basement somewhere, struggling to pay rent. I never once reached out to correct her. I valued my peace and quiet far more than I valued the petty satisfaction of proving her wrong. I completely and intentionally insulated myself from their toxic, superficial world, until the heavy, cream-colored envelope arrived at my penthouse apartment. It was an invitation with expensive gold foil lettering. Carter was getting engaged to a woman named Chloe Gallagher. The Gallagher family, as in Gallagher Innovations. I sat in my massive corner office at Apex Vanguard headquarters, holding the invitation in my hand. My lead corporate lawyer had just left my office less than an hour prior. He had dropped off a massive, intimidating stack of highly confidential legal documents on my mahogany desk. Gallagher Innovations, the historically legendary firm founded by the great Desmond Gallagher, had recently suffered a catastrophic market collapse. Their stock was in an absolute freefall due to a series of disastrous investments. The only thing standing between Desmond and total, humiliating corporate bankruptcy was a friendly $3 billion buyout. A buyout that my company, Apex Vanguard, was fully financing. A buyout that I, Elijah, the family disappointment, was personally scheduled to sign and authorize on Monday morning at 9 o'clock sharp. My family, completely and utterly ignorant of the massive, sweeping corporate warfare happening in the background of their pathetic social climbing, was aggressively trying to marry into a family that was currently bleeding to death financially. Margaret and Carter thought they had successfully trapped a clueless billionaire heir to secure their own financial supremacy and a massive future inheritance. They had absolutely no idea they were enthusiastically chaining themselves to a rapidly sinking ship. As I stared at the invitation, my private office phone rang. It was Aunt Sarah, my mother's younger sister. She was the family gossip, a deeply bitter woman who thrived on drama and disguised her vicious malice as genuine familial concern. "Elijah, sweetie, did you get the beautiful invitation?" Her nasally, irritating voice grated through the speakerphone. "I did, Sarah," I replied, leaning back in my leather chair. "Oh, it's going to be the social event of the entire decade," she bragged, her voice dripping with condescension. "The Gallaghers are practically American royalty. Carter did so incredibly well for himself. Your mother is just over the moon. She actually told me she hopes you don't come and ruin the aesthetic of the photos with your cheap clothes. But I told her, Margaret, he's still blood. Even if he's struggling, you really should come, Elijah. See how the other half lives. It might actually motivate you to get a real job with a decent salary." I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, watching the city traffic move like tiny ants hundreds of feet below me. A brilliant, highly destructive, and perfectly poetic realization formed in my mind. "I'll be there, Sarah," I said calmly, letting a small smile touch my lips. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." I decided right then and there that I was going to attend this gala. Not as a loving brother, not as a supportive guest, but as an auditor. I needed to see exactly how Desmond Gallagher operated under extreme social pressure, and more importantly, I needed to see exactly what kind of parasites were actively attempting to attach themselves to his remaining assets. It was the ultimate, unavoidable stress test. The engagement gala was held at a sprawling, historic oceanfront estate in Newport, Rhode Island. It was the exact kind of property that screamed generational wealth and old money. It had massive wrought iron gates, perfectly manicured, towering hedges, and a long, sweeping gravel driveway that was currently lined with dozens of expensive European sports cars. I flew in on my private Gulfstream jet early that afternoon. My private security team had a custom armored black Rolls-Royce Cullinan waiting for me on the private tarmac, its engine purring quietly. But as I walked down the steps of the plane, I stopped. I told my lead driver to take the Cullinan to the hotel and stay there. Instead, I walked over to the standard airport rental counter and paid in cash for a completely ordinary, slightly dented mid-size sedan. I drove it myself. I knew exactly what would happen if I pulled up to that Newport estate in a $500,000 armored vehicle with a security detail. It would instantly trigger a massive, uncontrollable psychological meltdown from my mother. She would spend the entire night frantically trying to figure out who I rented it from or who I was trying to scam, and I needed her completely off guard. I needed her to believe the exact narrative she had written for me. I parked the cheap, dusty rental car near the very back of the sprawling lot, intentionally nestling it between a line of dirty catering vans and staff vehicles. I stepped out into the cool ocean air, adjusting the cuffs of my bespoke Italian silk suit. It was a dark, rich charcoal gray, tailored to absolute perfection, completely devoid of any flashy logos but undeniably expensive to anyone who understood quality. I pulled a long, heavy wool trench coat over it to block the sharp coastal wind, effectively hiding the suit entirely from view. I walked up the wide, sweeping stone steps and pushed through the heavy, intricately carved front doors. The grand foyer of the estate was truly breathtaking. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the high vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, glittering glow over the imported marble floors. Highly trained waitstaff moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays of expensive champagne. The low, sophisticated hum of classical music mixed seamlessly with the polite chatter of the wealthy guests. I barely made it 3 steps inside the foyer before she found me. Margaret materialized out of the dense crowd like a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. She wore a shimmering, overly embellished designer gown that probably cost more than most people make in a year. Her eyes locked onto my face, and I immediately saw the flash of absolute, unadulterated panic completely take over her features. She didn't say hello. She didn't offer a hug. She closed the distance between us in 3 rapid steps, her manicured fingers shooting out and digging painfully into my bicep like a vice grip. "What in God's name are you doing here?" she hissed through a terrifyingly fake, tight-lipped smile, nodding politely to a passing couple as she dug her nails deeper into my arm. "I received an invitation, Margaret," I replied smoothly, keeping my voice perfectly level and not resisting as she violently dragged me away from the bright lights of the main entrance. She pulled me down a long, dimly lit, carpeted hallway away from the main party and violently shoved me into a vacant cloakroom. It was a dark, cramped space filled with hundreds of expensive winter coats, smelling strongly of mothballs and heavy, expensive perfume. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut behind us, locking us in the dim, claustrophobic light. "You cannot be here," she spat, her chest heaving with severe anxiety. "Preston's family controls half of the global communications infrastructure. The governor of the state is currently drinking champagne in the back garden. We cannot have your embarrassing poverty and your pathetic, dead-end IT support job ruining the program this evening." I stood there in the shadows, looking down at her. She hadn't changed even a fraction of an inch in 10 years. She still possessed the exact same frantic, desperate obsession with status, the exact same vicious, calculated cruelty toward anyone who didn't serve her immediate narrative. She aggressively dug into a clear plastic laundry bag sitting on a folding chair in the corner of the room. She violently pulled out a cheap, stiff, incredibly ugly black polyester catering vest and a generic, poorly stitched white button-down shirt. She shoved them directly into my chest. "Put this uniform on right now," she commanded, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. "If you absolutely insist on being in this house tonight, you are going to make yourself useful. Keep your head down. Serve the appetizers. Do not speak to anyone. If Desmond Gallagher's wife or any of his executives ask who you are simply hired help from the catering agency. I will not let you destroy your brother's future just by existing in the same room. Do you understand me?" I looked down at the scratchy, horrible fabric resting against my hands. I thought about the $3 billion acquisition contract currently sitting securely on my desk back home. I thought about Desmond Gallagher, a man known for his ruthlessness, currently sweating through his tuxedo, desperately waiting for my signature to save his life's work. And I thought about my mother, aggressively and foolishly attempting to hide me from a man who was currently entirely dependent on my mercy to survive the week. The sheer, delicious, unbelievable irony of the situation washed over me like a warm wave. I couldn't have planned a more perfect, revealing test if I had hired a team of psychologists to design it. I decided in that exact moment to accept her terms without a fight. Putting on this cheap polyester vest was the ultimate irrefutable stress test. It was the only way to expose my family's true, ugly nature directly to the very people they were trying so desperately to impress. "Fine," I said softly, keeping my face completely blank. Margaret let out a sharp, ragged breath of relief. She actually thought she had won. She firmly believed she had successfully forced me back into the tiny, insignificant box she had built for me all those years ago. "Hurry up. The VIPs are getting restless, and the catering staff is shorthanded," she snapped, turning sharply on her heel, unlocking the door, and marching out of the cloakroom without a second glance. I locked the door behind her. I stripped off my heavy wool trench coat. I carefully took off my expensive silk suit jacket, folded it meticulously, and laid it over a sturdy wooden hanger, hiding it deep behind a long row of heavy fur coats. I slipped the cheap, translucent white shirt over my undershirt and buttoned the stiff, unforgiving polyester vest. I looked at myself in the small, smudged mirror hanging on the back of the door. The transformation was complete. I looked exactly like what they wanted me to be. Completely invisible. A servant. A ghost. I unlocked the door, walked down the long hallway, and pushed through the heavy swinging metal doors into the massive industrial kitchen. It was a scene of absolute, disorganized chaos. Head chefs were screaming orders, metal pans were clattering loudly against industrial sinks, and waiters were rushing back and forth. A panicked, red-faced catering manager saw me standing there, shoved a heavy silver tray loaded with caviar into my hands, and pointed frantically toward the doors. "Table 4, the high tops near the massive ice sculpture. Move, move, move," he barked, sweat dripping down his forehead. I gripped the cold metal edges of the tray. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the chaotic, deafening noise of the kitchen wash over me, and stepped out through the doors and into the lavish main ballroom. The game had officially begun, and nobody in the room knew they were playing. The ballroom was an absolute, blinding spectacle of extreme, unchecked wealth. Towering, extravagant floral centerpieces dominated every single table in the room. Brilliant crystal lighting cast long, dramatic shadows across the marble floors. I spent the next 90 minutes circulating through the dense crowd in absolute, disciplined dead silence. It was deeply fascinating to experience the world from this specific perspective. When you wear the cheap uniform of the working class in a room packed full of arrogant billionaires and politicians, you become completely invisible. You lose your humanity in their eyes. You are simply a piece of moving furniture that dispenses expensive snacks. I walked past tight groups of powerful executives actively discussing hostile takeovers, impending corporate lawsuits, and massive layoffs. I overheard a prominent state politician aggressively arguing with his lawyer on his cell phone about a messy, highly publicized divorce, and a bitter custody battle. Nobody lowered their voice when I approached with the tray. Nobody stopped their sensitive conversations. They looked right through me like I was made of glass. I slowly navigated my way toward the grand, sweeping staircase. My brother, Carter, stood at the very center of a large, boisterous group of wealthy friends. He was radiating the unearned, obnoxious arrogance of a man entirely comfortable spending money he did not actually earn. He was holding court, loudly boasting about his upcoming month-long honeymoon in Monaco and a massive, fabricated promotion he claimed to have just secured at a top-tier venture capital firm. I knew for an absolute fact he hadn't worked a real, honest day in his entire life. Standing a few feet away from him, completely isolated despite being in a crowd, was Chloe, his newly minted fiancée. She wore a custom, incredibly intricate couture gown that looked heavy, stiff, and deeply restrictive. While Carter laughed loudly, throwing his head back and commanding attention, Chloe looked utterly miserable. She stared down at the massive, gaudy diamond ring on her finger with an expression of profound, soul-crushing exhaustion. She looked exactly like a prisoner who had just been handed a life sentence without the possibility of parole. That was an incredibly interesting detail. She wasn't an eager, gold-digging participant in this social climb. She was a helpless bargaining chip her father was utilizing to secure an alliance and project an image of stability. Across the sprawling room, standing casually near the main mahogany bar, I locked eyes with Marcus, my chief operating officer, my closest friend. He was wearing a stunning, custom-tailored tuxedo, holding a glass of expensive scotch, effortlessly blending in with the elite guests. I had specifically invited him to come observe the evening. When he saw me carrying the heavy silver tray while wearing the cheap polyester vest, his eyes widened slightly in surprise, and then a slow, knowing smirk played at the corners of his mouth. He subtly raised his crystal glass to me, silently acknowledging the brilliant, devastating trap I was currently setting. I continued my slow rounds. I walked directly past Carter's table. As I moved by, Carter actually raised his hand and snapped his fingers aggressively, directly at my face. The sharp, demanding snap, snap, sound cut cleanly through the ambient noise of the string quartet. He pointed a manicured finger to an empty, lipstick-stained cocktail glass sitting on a high-top table. "Clear this trash away, staff, and bring me another double bourbon," Carter demanded, his voice dripping with entitlement. He didn't even look up at my face. He looked directly at my chest, right where a plastic name tag would normally be pinned. Julian, a loudmouthed, obnoxious tech bro friend of Carter's, laughed loudly. "Make sure you don't water it down this time, pal. We actually tip well here if you do your job right." I stopped dead in my tracks. My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. I could feel Margaret watching the entire humiliating interaction from across the room. She shot me a terrifying, wide-eyed glare, silently and aggressively commanding me to obey him without a single second of hesitation. I didn't say a word. I smoothly picked up his dirty glass, placed it carefully onto my silver tray, and walked back toward the kitchen doors. I wasn't bothered by his profound disrespect. I was simply gathering vital data. I was patiently counting down the minutes until the architect of the Gallagher dynasty finally walked through the front doors. The heavy mahogany doors of the main ballroom swung open violently, precisely at 8:15 p.m. The underlying ambient noise of the party immediately died down to a hushed whisper. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note. Desmond Gallagher finally stepped into the room. He commanded total, undeniable authority. He was surrounded by a tight, protective cluster of his senior executive team and two massive, highly trained private security contractors. But despite the imposing, intimidating entourage, Desmond looked incredibly, deeply exhausted. His sharp, usually handsome features were heavily weighed down by the intense, crushing stress of his rapidly failing company. His skin was pale, almost gray. He carried the heavy, undeniable aura of a man walking slowly to his own execution. Margaret instantly abandoned her conversation with the governor's wife. She slapped on a terrifyingly wide, incredibly fake smile and practically sprinted across the polished marble floor to greet him. She grabbed my father, Richard, by the arm, violently dragging him along behind her like a prop. Carter quickly puffed out his chest, stepping forward confidently to shake his future father-in-law's hand, loudly and obnoxiously welcoming him to the celebration. I stood completely still near a towering ice sculpture of a swan, holding my tray of caviar, watching the sickening, pathetic display of sycophantic groveling unfold. Margaret was practically vibrating with desperate, nervous excitement. She talked rapidly at Desmond, endlessly and inappropriately complimenting his massive real estate holdings, aggressively attempting to solidify her new, fragile position among the ultra-elite. Desmond offered her a polite, entirely hollow nod. He accepted a crystal flute of champagne from a passing waiter without looking at him. His dark eyes scanned the massive room with the distinct, undeniable impatience of a man who possessed far more important, life-altering things to worry about than a suburban engagement gala. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on planet Earth. This was the exact moment. The stress test was finally ready to be concluded. I tightly gripped the cold metal edges of my silver tray. I stepped away from the melting ice sculpture. I navigated smoothly and deliberately through the dense crowd of wealthy, powerful guests. I didn't skirt the edges of the room like a lowly server is trained to do. I walked directly into the dead center of the floor, cutting a perfectly straight, undeniable line toward the Gallagher family. Margaret caught sight of my approach out of the corner of her eye. Her eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. The fake smile strained so hard on her face I thought her skin might tear. She subtly gritted her teeth, violently shaking her head back and forth, trying to silently and desperately order me back to the kitchen. She was terrified that the hired help was about to embarrass her and interrupt her crucial, life-changing introduction. I ignored her completely. I stopped exactly 3 feet in front of the billionaire tech mogul. I lowered the silver tray slightly, squared my shoulders, stood up to my full height, and offered him a steady, unblinking stare. "Would you care for an appetizer, Mr. Gallagher?" I asked. My voice was calm, deep, and it cut cleanly through the nervous chatter of the surrounding executives. Desmond glanced down at the tray, visibly annoyed by the sudden interruption. He opened his mouth, likely to rudely dismiss me. Then, his eyes traveled up the cheap black polyester catering vest, past the poorly stitched white collar, and finally locked directly onto my face. The reaction was instantaneous, and it was catastrophic. Desmond Gallagher's entire body went completely rigid, as if a massive, invisible electrical current had just surged directly up his spine. The polite, hollow expression he had been wearing all evening vanished, replaced instantly by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. His jaw dropped slightly, the muscles in his cheek twitching uncontrollably. His fingers completely lost their grip. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his hand, plunging toward the ground and shattering violently against the hard, imported marble floor, sending a spray of expensive alcohol and broken glass directly across my mother's designer shoes. The sharp, explosive sound of the breaking glass caused the entire ballroom to fall into absolute, suffocating silence. It was the kind of heavy, oppressive silence you only ever experience at a funeral right before the casket is lowered into the ground. The string quartet stopped playing instantly, the cellist literally freezing with his bow suspended in the air. 50 of the most powerful politicians, tech executives, and old-money socialites turned their heads in absolute unison to watch the scene unfold. Liam, Desmond's massive lead security contractor, instantly took a step forward. His hand reached up to the earpiece hidden in his collar, his eyes scanning me for a weapon, preparing to neutralize whatever threat had just caused his billionaire boss to drop his drink. Desmond threw his hand out violently, palm flat, physically blocking his own security guard from moving another inch. "Do not touch him," Desmond commanded, his voice shaking. Desmond completely ignored the puddle of champagne soaking into his tailored trousers. He violently shoved past his own security detail, stepped directly into the small space between me and the melting ice sculpture, and bowed his head. It was not a polite high society nod. It was a deep, undeniable display of absolute, terrifying submission in front of half the state's elite. "Sir," Desmond stammered, his voice trembling with genuine, unfiltered dread as he looked at the cheap, scratchy catering uniform covering my shoulders. "I am profoundly horrified. I do not understand what is happening here." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mother let out a high-pitched, incredibly violent gasp of absolute terror. She physically stumbled backward, her hip crashing hard into a high-top cocktail table. The table wobbled, spilling a martini onto the floor. Her brain completely and utterly failed to process the words leaving the billionaire's mouth. Desmond did not even look at her. He kept his eyes locked firmly on mine, pure panic radiating from him. "Sir," Desmond continued, his voice rising in volume, echoing off the high, vaulted ceiling so every single person in the room could hear him. "Why is the sole founder and CEO of Apex Vanguard, the man who personally holds the proprietary patents to my entire global network, and the billionaire who is exclusively financing the $3 billion acquisition of my firm on Monday morning, currently serving fish eggs to my junior staff?" A collective, massive gasp ripped through the crowd of VIP guests. The whispers started immediately, buzzing like a hive of angry hornets. My mother's face twisted into a mask of pure, paralyzing horror. Her meticulously maintained, decades-long facade of superiority shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a fraction of a second. She stared at me, the son she had spent her entire life hiding, belittling, and mocking, as if I had just grown a second head. "Mr. Gallagher," my mother choked out. She took a frantic step forward, inserting herself into the space. Her voice was desperate, shrill, and completely devoid of its usual arrogant confidence. "Mr. Gallagher, please, you must be mistaken. You are confused by the lighting. This is Elijah. He is my son. He is a nobody. He fixes computers in a basement. He is just helping out the catering staff tonight because he needs the extra money. He is not a CEO. He is not a billionaire." Desmond slowly turned his head to look at my mother. The sheer, overwhelming disgust on his face was a magnificent thing to witness. He looked at her like she was a piece of rotting garbage that had somehow washed up onto his pristine beach. "Shut your mouth," Desmond ordered. He didn't yell. His voice was low, lethal, and dripping with venom. "Do not speak to me again, you spectacular idiot. The man holding that silver tray literally owns the physical servers that process every single financial transaction your family relies on. He built an empire from absolute scratch while you were busy playing dress-up in rented ball gowns." Carter, my golden child brother, finally stepped forward. His face was flushed bright red with a mixture of profound embarrassment and lingering, unearned arrogance. He still couldn't grasp the reality of the situation. He was too deeply entrenched in his own lifelong delusion of superiority. "Desmond, with all due respect, my mother is right," Carter said, trying to puff out his chest and project authority, failing miserably. "Elijah is a college dropout. He doesn't own any tech company. He's a liar and a manipulator. I don't know what kind of scam he's trying to run here, but I will have security throw him out right now. Liam, grab him and toss him out." Desmond spun around and took a fast, aggressive step toward Carter, entirely abandoning his sophisticated public persona. He looked like he wanted to physically strangle my brother right there on the marble floor. "If your security guard so much as breathes on him, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your pathetic life working a minimum wage salary cleaning out storm drains," Desmond roared, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent ballroom. "You arrogant, sheltered, useless fool. You are currently entirely dependent on his goodwill to maintain your pathetic, comfortable existence. If he decides to pull his funding on Monday morning because of your profound disrespect, my company collapses entirely. And any future inheritance you thought you were marrying into vanishes into thin air. You will have absolutely nothing." Carter's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish out of water. The reality finally, brutally hit him. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sick, small, and utterly defenseless. He looked down at the empty bourbon glass I had cleared for him just 10 minutes earlier, realizing the magnitude of his mistake. Desmond turned back to me, his hands actually clasped together tightly in front of him, silently pleading. "Please, sir, I beg you, tell me this is some kind of elaborate corporate test. Tell me you aren't pulling your funding. If my son's new family has somehow disrespected you by forcing you into this humiliating uniform, I will cancel this engagement immediately. I will strip Carter of his position. I will do whatever it takes. Just tell me the buyout is still moving forward." I calmly placed the heavy silver tray of caviar down onto the nearest marble table. I was entirely unbothered by the absolute, hysterical chaos erupting around me. I maintained the exact same cold, analytical authority I utilize every single day in the boardroom when negotiating hostile takeovers. "It is not a bizarre test regarding your firm's financials, Desmond," I replied, projecting my voice clearly so every single wealthy guest, politician, and executive in the room could hear the absolute truth. "Your company's financial audits are solid. The numbers make sense. The buyout will proceed entirely as planned on Monday morning." Desmond let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. His shoulders slumped forward as the crushing weight of impending bankruptcy finally lifted off his chest. He closed his eyes for a brief second, thanking whatever God he prayed to. "However," I continued, my voice hardening, cutting through the silence like a finely sharpened blade, "this was a highly necessary stress test regarding the specific people attempting to legally attach themselves to your family and your legacy." I turned my head and locked eyes with my mother. She was physically shaking now, her hands pressed tightly against her mouth, tears of absolute, profound humiliation welling up in her eyes and ruining her expensive makeup. My mother and my brother forced me into this polyester uniform the second I walked through the front door of this estate, I stated loudly, watching the elite guests exchange shocked, disgusted whispers. "They ordered me to avoid eye contact with your guests because they were deeply, pathetically terrified that my existence would expose their true origins. They value human beings entirely based on perceived social utility, external wealth, and the brand of the clothes they wear." I stepped closer to Margaret, looking down at her trembling frame. The height difference felt massive in that moment. "When I left your house at 18 to build servers in a rented garage, you explicitly told me I would be a failure. You completely cut me out of your lives, assuming I was useless because I could not advance your superficial social standing. I simply allowed you to continue believing that narrative for 10 years because I completely refused to allow parasites to attach themselves to the empire I built with my own hands." The ballroom remained frozen in that suffocating, heavy silence. The guests, people who thrived on corporate ruthlessness and vicious social gossip, were absolutely mesmerized by the ultimate high society disaster unfolding in real time right in front of their eyes. Nobody even reached for their phones. They were too captivated by the sheer destruction taking place. I turned my attention directly to Margaret, who was currently weeping openly into her manicured hands. She was completely and utterly destroyed by the sudden, violent realization that she had spent the last decade aggressively alienating the single most powerful billionaire in the room, all while trying to impress people who now looked at her with blatant, unconcealed disgust. "You demanded I make myself useful tonight, Margaret," I noted, my tone entirely devoid of anger, sadness, or vindictiveness. I was simply stating a hard, undeniable fact. I just saved the Gallagher dynasty from legally binding themselves to a family of superficial, manipulative social climbers who would have undoubtedly drained their assets, ruined their public reputation, and driven them into the ground. I would consider that an incredibly useful evening of work. Desmond Gallagher did not hesitate for a single second. He was a ruthless, seasoned corporate survivor who understood exactly how to cut his losses and protect his core assets. He turned toward his future son-in-law. His expression was hard, cold, and entirely unforgiving. "Take that ring off her finger right now," Desmond ordered, pointing a shaking, angry finger directly at Carter. Carter stumbled backward, his eyes wide with sheer panic. He reached out toward Desmond, his hands pleading. "Desmond, please, we love each other. You can't do this. The invitations are out. The press knows. The deposits are paid. This engagement is completely and permanently terminated," Desmond barked, stepping closer to Carter, forcing the younger man to cower backward into a waiter. "You are not marrying into my family. I absolutely refuse to legally attach my hard-earned legacy to individuals who are dumb enough and cruel enough to hand a catering tray to the man who owns the entire underlying infrastructure of our industry. If you argue with me, I will have my lawyers freeze every joint account associated with this wedding tonight, and I will personally ensure you are blacklisted from every venture capital firm on the East Coast. Do you understand me?" Carter, entirely lacking a spine, any moral compass, or any genuine loyalty to the woman he claimed to love, immediately caved under the intense pressure. He turned to Chloe, his face pale and sweating profusely, and silently held out his trembling hand, demanding the massive, custom-designed diamond ring back. This was the exact moment that truly exposed the rotten core of the arrangement. Chloe did not burst into hysterical tears. She did not beg Carter to reconsider. She did not profess her undying love or try to save the relationship. Instead, a look of profound, undeniable relief washed over Chloe's face. The heavy, restrictive tension she had been carrying all night completely vanished from her shoulders. She reached down, easily slid the massive diamond off her finger, and dropped it unceremoniously into Carter's shaking palm. It made a small clinking sound as it hit his skin. She didn't say a single word to him. She didn't even look at him. She just turned around, picked up the long train of her heavy couture gown, and walked away from him, disappearing into the crowd of guests without looking back once. It was the most dignified, satisfying exit I had ever witnessed. Carter stood there alone in the center of the room, holding the ring, looking completely pathetic and entirely abandoned by everyone. I reached up to the collar of the cheap, scratchy black polyester catering vest. I unbuttoned it slowly, deliberately, making sure every single person in the room watched me do it. I pulled it off my shoulders, exposing the crisp, incredibly expensive white dress shirt underneath. I dropped the cheap vest directly onto the marble floor, letting it land right in front of Margaret's expensive, trembling designer shoes. "Do not attempt to contact my corporate offices," I instructed my mother, offering her one final, completely detached look. I didn't feel hatred toward her anymore. I just felt an overwhelming sense of nothingness. "Do not show up at my security gates. Do not call my phone. You successfully removed the embarrassment from your social circle tonight. You will never have to worry about looking at me again." I turned my back on my family. I did not wait for an apology, because I knew they were entirely incapable of giving a genuine one. I walked slowly and purposefully across the silent ballroom. The sea of wealthy guests, prominent politicians, and powerful executives immediately parted for me, stepping back to clear a wide, respectful path. Their eyes were wide with a mixture of shock, profound respect, and deep intimidation. I walked out of the massive mahogany doors, past the towering floral arrangements in the grand foyer, and exited through the heavy iron front doors into the crisp, cool ocean air. The valet rushed frantically to bring me my cheap rental car, practically tripping over himself. I tipped him $100 bill, got into the driver's seat, and drove out of the massive iron gates, leaving the burning wreckage of my family's social ambitions far behind me in the rearview mirror. Monday morning arrived with crisp, highly efficient clarity. The contrast between the chaotic, emotionally charged, toxic atmosphere of the Newport estate and the sleek, silent power of the Apex Vanguard headquarters was absolutely staggering. I sat at the head of a massive, custom-built mahogany conference table in my glass-walled boardroom on the 50th floor. The city skyline stretched out beneath us in every direction, a sprawling grid of commerce and industry that relied heavily on the servers my company maintained. I was wearing a new, perfectly tailored midnight blue suit. My legal team, a row of sharp, highly paid professionals, sat to my left, carefully organizing the final acquisition documents. Desmond Gallagher sat directly across from me. He looked like a completely different man than the terrified, sweating father I had seen dropping a glass on Saturday night. He looked rested, sharp, and deeply respectful. He was immensely grateful for the massive capital injection that was about to save his life's work, and he was entirely aware of exactly who held the absolute authority in the room. He picked up a heavy gold fountain pen and signed his name at the bottom of the final contract, legally and permanently absorbing Gallagher Innovations into the Apex Vanguard conglomerate. The ink dried, sealing the fate of his company and securing his legacy. "Elijah," Desmond said smoothly, sliding the heavy leather binder across the polished table toward me. "I want to formally apologize again for the absolute circus at the estate this weekend. I had absolutely no idea the kind of people I was dealing with. My vetting process clearly failed." "It's handled, Desmond," I replied, signing my own name with quick, precise strokes. "Business is business. We simply excised the bad debt before it could infect the ledger." And the bad debt had indeed been fully excised. Over the next few weeks, the true, devastating aftermath of Saturday night's disastrous gala trickled back to me through the highly efficient corporate grapevine and a few well-placed private investigators I kept on retainer. My mother's meticulously constructed world completely collapsed, falling apart faster and harder than I could have ever predicted. It turned out that Margaret had not just spent her regular savings on that extravagant engagement party. Desperate to project an image of limitless, generational wealth to the Gallagher family, she had secretly taken out a massive, highly predatory second mortgage on their family home to fund the entire event. She paid for the imported caviar, the towering floral centerpieces, the classical string quartet, the expensive lighting rentals, and the designer clothes entirely on borrowed money. She firmly believed that Carter marrying into a billionaire family would easily cover the massive debt once they had access to his new wealth. When Desmond officially canceled the engagement and publicly blacklisted Carter from his social circles, the creditors immediately came knocking. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings within the month. My father, Richard, the man who had spent his entire life silently hiding behind his newspaper and avoiding any form of conflict, finally snapped. When he discovered the secret second mortgage and the terrifying mountain of hidden debt Margaret had accumulated just to fuel her fragile ego, he exploded. The massive argument echoed through their entire neighborhood. He packed his bags that same night, moved into a cheap motel near the highway, and immediately filed for a messy, highly contentious divorce. He hired a ruthless lawyer, determined to protect his meager remaining pension from Margaret's catastrophic financial ruin. The resulting legal battle over custody of their remaining assets was brutal and completely drained whatever small funds they had left. They lost the house, the grand, suburban home Margaret had treated like a castle. The very place she had locked me out of the garage was auctioned off to the highest bidder by the bank to satisfy the debt. Carter, the golden child who had never worked a hard day in his life, found himself completely cut off from his mother's enabling and his father's wallet. With his reputation entirely destroyed in the high society circles he loved, and no actual college degree, work ethic, or marketable skills to fall back on, reality hit him like a runaway freight train. Desmond, acting on a promise he made during his rage at the party, pulled a few strings with his remaining industry contacts. He made sure every reputable firm knew exactly who Carter was and what he was capable of. Desperate for cash to pay rent on a tiny, run-down apartment, Carter was eventually forced to take a job managing inventory at a severely underperforming, non-air-conditioned logistics warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He had to wear a dirty, high-visibility vest and stand on his feet for 10 grueling hours a day, finally learning the harsh, brutal value of an actual minimum wage salary. I heard through a contact that he tried to quit after the very first week, complaining that the work was beneath him, but his landlord threatened eviction, forcing him to walk right back to the warehouse floor. And Aunt Sarah, the woman who had gleefully called my office to mock my supposed poverty and tell me to get a real job, she proved exactly how loyal the people in my mother's circle truly were. The second Margaret lost her money, her house, and her social standing, Sarah turned her back completely. Sarah spent her afternoons having lunch at the country club, loudly and joyfully spreading the entire story of Margaret's spectacular humiliation to anyone who would listen, permanently cementing my mother's status as an absolute social pariah in their community. They were completely exiled by the wealthy peers who had witnessed their downfall. They tore each other apart from the inside, fighting over scraps of a broken life, exactly as parasites do when the host finally dies. I didn't lift a single finger to cause any of it. I didn't plot elaborate revenge. I didn't hire lawyers to ruin them. I simply stood in a room, told the unvarnished truth, and allowed the heavy, crushing weight of their own lies and arrogance to completely destroy them. Several months later, I stood on the private balcony of my penthouse apartment, holding a cup of black coffee, watching the sun slowly set over the city skyline. The glass and steel buildings caught the fading light, turning the entire city into a glowing grid of gold and deep orange. I felt a profound, deeply settled sense of peace. The kind of total peace you only achieve when you finally, completely let go of a heavy burden you didn't even realize you had been carrying for a decade. For years, even while I was building Apex Vanguard, even while I was securing massive government contracts and watching my bank accounts grow into the billions, a small, injured part of my mind still cared about what my family thought of me. A small piece of that isolated teenager in the freezing garage still desperately wanted his mother to look at his achievements and finally admit that she was wrong. I wanted the validation, but standing in that lavish Newport ballroom, wearing a cheap, scratchy polyester catering vest and holding a tray of fish eggs, I finally understood the fundamental truth about power, respect, and self-worth. True power does not require a tailored bespoke suit. It does not require a flashy European sports car parked in the driveway. It does not require a formal, impressive introduction to a room full of arrogant strangers. And it certainly does not require the conditional, deeply flawed validation of a family who only loves you when you serve their personal agenda. True power simply requires the unwavering, absolute confidence to stand completely still in a room full of loud, arrogant people wearing a cheap uniform, feeling completely secure in the undeniable knowledge that you entirely own the ground they are standing on. I built an empire precisely because I learned very early in life that relying on the conditional affection of superficial people is a guaranteed, fast-tracked path to total ruin. My mother, my brother, and my father built their entire lives on a foundation of sand, relying on lies, appearances, and the money of others to keep them afloat. The second a real storm rolled in, the second they faced a real stress test, their foundation washed away, leaving them with absolutely nothing. I built my foundation on stone. I built it in the dark, in the cold, with dirty hands and countless sleepless nights. And because of that, no one can ever take it away from me. Not a demanding mother, not an arrogant brother, and not a room full of billionaires. I don't hate them anymore. Hatred requires a massive amount of energy, and I refuse to spend another ounce of my energy on people who belong firmly in my past. I just don't care. I am entirely free. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. It wasn't an easy one to tell, and opening up about family betrayal is always difficult, but putting it out there feels like the final step in closing this chapter of my life. I hope this resonated with you in some way. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to walk away from people who were supposed to support you, just to protect your own peace and build your own life? Tell me about it down below in the comments. I read as many of them as I can. If you made it all the way to this exact moment, I have a small request. Comment the letter W down below. W stands for winner. This is our secret code for the 1% Club, the incredibly small, elite group of amazing people who have the attention span and the empathy to stick with a story until the very end. When I see that W, I know exactly who the real ones are in my community. Please hit that like button if this story brought you some value today, and make sure to follow and subscribe so we can keep sharing these journeys together. Stay strong, keep building your own foundation, and I will see you in the next one.